Welcome. This is part 2 of my outline of the Leviathan. I'd recommend watching part 1 to better understand this video. Here we are, having arrived at Hobbes's Commonwealth, his grand political state. Now that man has endured the turbulence of their natural condition and survived the nightmarish landscape inhabited by the wolfman and the beasts, they should be rationally inclined after some time to follow the laws of nature, highlighted last video, which entail the simultaneous laying down of arms to expose mutual vulnerability, but at once conferring absolutely their sovereignty to an indivisible power, in the form of the Leviathan, and thus legitimating this state through rational inquiry. This is the transition out of the state of nature and into civilized society. The Leviathan, as Hobbes titles the book, is a reference to the sea serpent that was first depicted in the Book of Job. This gigantic monster figuratively represents Hobbes's ideal government, a commonwealth or state, as an unrelenting power. Hobbes approached the contention of which governance model is most effective with care, but out of the most common forms that dominate debate, including democracy, aristocracy and monarchy, Hobbes took most fondly to monarchy, as he believed it in most alignment with his conception of an absolute sovereign. He didn't take the term sovereign to be conflated with monarchy, as the sovereign might take many forms, but the monarchy only one. Hobbes largely does not distinguish whether his ideal monarchy ought to be singular, or an assembly of sovereign persons. This monarch must, however, be hereditary, not a product of democratic processes of uninformed voters, or the whims of large groups of people. The smaller the sample of rulers, the likelier the homogeneity. As long as this head of state is homogeneous in its application of legislation, and is placed above the civil constitution, then it is sufficient as the sovereign. And this sovereign body wields all arms of government: the judiciary, parliament, executive. Such institutions form a pyramidal hierarchy, each vested with discretion in their roles, but heavily subordinated to the sovereign. The prison guards see to the sentences ordered by the judge. The judge interprets the law as passed by legislators. The legislators are subjects of the sovereign. Under this state, the sovereign would even have the power to delineate cultural and normative doctrines, and broad control of morality. Most important to the sovereign in its powers is the capacity to establish civil legal principles applicable to the subjects. Here, civil law becomes the primary instrument of the sovereign to ensure order. The law is positive, meaning not of divine or natural origin, but a product of artificial condition that is brought to being by the head of state. For Hobbes, these laws become those rules, which the Commonwealth hath commanded, by word, writing, or other sufficient sign of the will. The rules are commands to be followed. But what might these rules look like? Hobbes was an absolutist, which is pretty clear in this work. It's easy to understand the rights of the sovereign, not by what they can do, but what they can't do, which is very little. Hobbes lays out in chapter 18 his explicit rights of the sovereign. For the sake of brevity, I won't go through all of them now, but importantly, the sovereign designs and ratifies law. It appoints its own ministers and statutory heads of office, interprets its own law, and even ban books it might seem dangerous, which is very exciting. In this universe, the sovereign is both the law and its enforcer. For Hobbes writes, "All covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all." And Hobbes advises, breaches of covenant carry penalties that exceed in severity the expected gain from the initial transgression, which was common in England during this period, like the Bloody Code, which saw offences on the statute book punishable by death rise by 400% from 1688 to 1776, which might include hanging for crimes such as cutting down trees, stealing sheep, or vandalizing fish ponds. Capital punishment was the penalty. Criminal justice in England prioritized jailing and throwing the book at the accused, which incidentally is a heavy feature of Hobbes's Leviathan. Hobbes was highly significant for his time, in the sense he established a tradition in the Enlightenment to consider government and the grand project of society as a form of social contract. This contract involves the subjects and the state, but unlike later social contract theorists like Locke or Rousseau, who might consider there's a sort of middle ground between a subject's freedom and government, Hobbes asserts that to even entertain this idea presents a grave danger. He also asserts that the critical determinant of a society's success is the strength of the contract among the ruled. If subjects are to question the legitimacy of the contract, or the sovereign confers persons the freedom to exercise individual will, then disagreement is likely to ensue. Quickly, these disagreements spiral into conflict before leading to civil war and violence. Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature exacts top-down order as the only way. The deterrence against violating the social contract provided by the state compels the violent man to act in an ordered manner. A rational and prudential actor under Hobbes's Leviathan state will not violate the covenants simply out of fear. This is the source of political legitimacy for Hobbes. The relative aversions and appetites of the state of nature are less favourable to pursue than the Leviathan. So, for a Leviathan state to function, subjects must prudentially consent to forfeit their will to the state, which in essence authorises the Leviathan to make all the decisions. The objective ontology of Hobbes's universe is self-preservation, discovered through instrumental rationality. The will is aimed towards preservation, and the way this is carried out as an individual is to first and foremost preserve the sovereign, and more specifically the delicate statute laws artificially agreed upon through civil reason. So let's say, having previously agreed to these covenants, you violate them in some way through breaking a law like stealing goats. The head of state, which might take the form of a monarchy, then decrees that you shall be put to death for your crime. In the process, you are offered no trial, no chance to make your case, no compromise on the verdict. Hypothetically, Hobbes says that you, the defendant, will be rationally inclined to accept your punishment, as you would be self-preserving your interests in the process. But there is a very significant contention here. As Hobbes does consider the right of the sovereign to condemn its subjects to death, there is a degree of right to resistance, he argues, to be present in individual subjects. And this might be where we locate some form of constraint upon the sovereign. It might be a logical contradiction in the absolutist model, but Hobbes does contend there is an inherent right or inclination among men, even under a condition of state society, to defend their own life from imminent danger. As it's understood, and this is highly contentious, Hobbes reconciled that men will possess this natural inclination and, as such, are afforded a degree of slack in its exercise against the sovereign. Subjects, to an extent, have liberty to disobey edicts that violate their self-preservation. This is a deviation from the absolutist account. Ultimately, though, the subject authorized the sovereign power to make any decision it needs to, and preserving the sovereign power is the end strived towards. Without treating the sovereign by its objective ends, then everyone is at risk of returning to the state of nature, through breach of the contract's delicate terms. Consent and unity is depicted by the frontispiece of the book, a large conglomerate, Leviathan state, represented as one unity, but within resides many subjects who share the same singular will, the same desire for top-down peace, as best encapsulated by the quote, "The only way to erect such a common power is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills, by plurality of voices unto one will." But Hobbes somewhat conveniently caveats for his Christian audience that if the sovereign were to coerce its subjects into actioning sinful deeds, then it would be the sovereign divinely held to account, and not the subjects. Esoterically, this may have been to save his own skin from accusations of heresy, though I will cover this in a moment. Constraints upon the sovereign are not limited to the individual's liberty to self-preserve themselves, but external forces exist as well, like the international hierarchy of states that equally seek peace and impose global laws and order upon nation-states. As well, this hierarchy might stipulate war crimes and the limits of abuse for nation-states. In a state of international anarchy, these generally normative, non-binding laws act as limiting forces, keeping a relative check in place on the sovereign. General commentaries of Hobbes are filled with charges against him of atheism from his secular state, and it is almost indisputable Hobbes is one of the first serious thinkers of the Enlightenment to produce systems of general skepticism, science, and reason. Hobbes, to be clear, however, is deistic and a worshipper of the Christian God. For the sovereign in a Christian state, the head of state is not only subject to natural law as the command of God, but as head of a Christian church, is responsible for the salvation of his subjects. Hobbes defines the Christian state as a church and ascribes to it a religious mission, which takes precedence over its legitimate worldly concerns. Hobbes clearly does not delineate religion as a tool at the sovereign's disposal, nor is his Leviathan state secular. To consider it as such is a lazy and poorly informed view that ignores much of his writing. Oakeshott remarks the greatness of Hobbes is that he constructed a political philosophy that reflected the changes in the European intellectual consciousness, which had been pioneered chiefly by the theologians of the 15th and 16th centuries. The history of philosophy was travelling at lightning speed down a path towards secularization, but Hobbes, as an Anglican Christian, heralded a theological state. His problem of religion is primarily in his metaphysics. To consider God as a being as the first cause is divorced from the scholastic account to consider God as being itself. Scholasticism and the Aristotelian account was being more thoroughly refuted, and Hobbes was instrumental in joining this program. Further, the later emergence of the flagrant atheist was in many ways informed by the principles of Hobbes's rationalization and intellectualization that would eventually catalyze the reduction of God to a non-essential afterthought. But this does not, however, diminish the Anglican theology of Hobbes. Hobbes's Leviathan was written in 17th century England, a murderous and vile chapter in English history that saw multiple civil wars between the Crown and Parliament, the Puritan movement, as well as disputes involving the Irish and Scottish nationalists and states. The Leviathan is Hobbes's attempt to wash this blood from London's streets, to propose a solution to the seemingly never-ending cycle of violence. This chapter Hobbes lived through informed a personally pacifist conviction, however difficult you might find that to be reading the text. Further, it's really important not to think of Hobbes and immediately consider him as some sort of totalitarian advocating for brutal regimes that a modern audience immediately associates with tyrants through the 20th century. In reality, governments of the 16th century didn't have access to the bureaucracy, technology, or capacity of a surveillance state like we understand today. The project of the modern nation-state had really only just begun as Hobbes wrote this work. The European continent had historically, up until this point, and thereafter for a long time, been in a constant state of petitioning, dissolution, and annexation. England had ensured its borders for some centuries before Hobbes, but that was no guarantee of perpetual stability. So the Leviathan state, as Hobbes conceptualized, would have struggled to survive even at the best of times, certainly a far cry from the overreach of the contemporary world and our bias towards the nation-state. The Leviathan is a product of its time, and ought to be treated as such, allowing moderns to extract relevant ideas from the text. To best achieve this, it is critical to approach the Leviathan with an intellectual rigor capable of confronting the rich methodology and formulations conceived by Hobbes. The Leviathan presents very fresh but abstract concepts in a positivistic manner. Hobbes, in this sense, is very much blazing a trail in this work, and much of what he is doing he accomplishes going in blind. But if you do away with the modern prejudices, and take this methodology and the conclusions on their merit, what emerges is a classic work of politics and metaphysics.